You're listening to the Talking Headways Podcast Network.
Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. Talking Mondays. Keep moving on. Keep moving on.
Happy Monday. This is Mondays at the Overhead Wire, sponsored by our generous Patreon supporters. I'm Jeff Wood, your host, and joined by Han Solo. That's right, every Wookiee's favorite right-hand man is here with me today. Today I have a glass of wine because, well, I wanted one. And probably needed one with a teething baby in the house. But as we do when we're Han Solo, we got a preview of some upcoming Talking Headways episodes I want to share with everybody, and really looking forward to talking about what's coming up next. So I'm sure that they'll air at some point, but not really sure exactly when that's going to be. But we've got Diane Jones-Allen, Dr. Diane Jones-Allen, talking about ASLA's new sustainability plan. We've got Jennifer Kent coming back on the show to talk about how families travel and why cars are so easy to choose sometimes for families. Lynn Peterson is going to be on the show, and she's going to talk about her book, Roadways for People, which I'm really looking forward to reading. Also, David Hencher is going to be on from Australia to talk about his idea, mobility as a feature. So I'm interested to find out more about what he means by that. And also, as we do each year with Yona Freemark, we have an annual prediction show, and that one's coming up soon. We're working with Yona, trying to figure out when that's going to be, but it'll come up soon. So looking forward to that, as many of you do. I look forward to it. I know that a lot of you are really excited when that show comes out because it's a fun one. It's a fun one, and it's a kind of a repetitive annual thing for the longtime listeners. So we've got lots to look forward to. Great shows coming up. I know a lot of you have had some really good suggestions about possible ideas for shows, and we're working on seeing if we can't fit some of those in. So some guests are harder to come by than others, as I've talked about in the past, but we'll give it our best shot. All right. Well, thanks to everybody who also orders our bus-only scarves and bike-only scarves. We really appreciate it. If you'd like to order one, go to theoverheadwire.com. If you want more than 5, I'll give you a 10% discount. Email me at theoverheadwire@gmail.com if you want to give them out to your friends and family or your colleagues at work. And it's still cold outside, so go to the Overhead Wire, get your scarves, and you'll definitely love them. And thanks, everybody, for your pictures on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and other places of you wearing your scarves. I love seeing them out on cold days in the winter, and it really does warm my heart, and I think it's really fun. So, get your scarf if you get a chance, and if you do get a scarf, feel free to share where you're wearing it, whether it's on the metro, at TRB, in the snow, on your bike, whatever, wherever. That's looking forward to seeing where folks wear their scarves. And also, don't forget to order any of the books we've covered on the show, Talking Headways, from our bookshop site, bookshop.org/shop/theoverheadwire. And so I do want to note that Bookshop doesn't carry every book, almost every book, just 2 that aren't in the shop. And that's Dorina Pajani's book from Elgar, from Springer, and Elgar with David King and Kevin Kryzak's book. So go to Elgar and Springer websites to find their books. And Kevin and David's book, Advanced Introduction to Urban Transport Planning, is a really good one. So hopefully folks get a chance to check it out, especially if you're in planning school or transportation planning school for that matter. And finally, we've also designed a mug, shirt, sticker, poster, whatever you want to do with the Cars Are Cholesterol sticker. So I collaborated with artist and listener Richard Wazensky on a new design that you all have seen or heard from. I'm actually, randomly putting stickers in people's scarf packages too with Cars Are Cholesterol. And also, if you're a Patreon member, which we'll talk about a little later, you'll get one of those stickers too if you do the $2 a month subscription. So we really appreciate that. So go to TeePublic and you can get their Cars Are Cholesterol everything, bit.ly/Cars Are Cholesterol. Get the purple shirt. It's the best one. Okay, well, we're back, and this is episode 126. We're in session, and before we get to the show, I want to let folks know that they can get this podcast by going to iHeartRadio, Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, and of course, Apple Podcasts if it is working. Thanks to the folks who subscribe through podcatchers, you get both Talking Headways and Mondays at the Overhead Wire. We really appreciate it on the Talking Headways Podcast Network. Okay, so This is what you guys come here for. You all come here for the news. So here are a few stories that piqued our interest from our newsletter, the Overhead Wire Daily, over the last few weeks. And these are some of the popular items at the top. And then at the bottom, I'll share some of the ones that I thought were interesting myself personally, which aren't always the popular ones. And I'm never quite sure which ones are going to be popular or not, but they come out the way that they do. All right, so lessons from a successful e-bike rebate pilot. E-bike rebate vouchers offered by Denver's Office of Climate Action, Sustainability, and Resiliency were so popular that they were gone within 20 minutes of the program launching. Program officials talked about lessons learned from the successful launch so that they can be replicated elsewhere, highlighting the need to scale up and the role of budget flexibility. This was by Maria Rachal at Smart Cities Dive. So the program was a booming success, and I'm not sure why we don't try to do this in more places. It's also really crazy that we've given away so much money for electric cars and trucks to juice a transition when this is an uber super popular way to do so for less money, the e-bike rebates. And it's crazy. They were just sold out in Denver like that. And it's really cool that they had like a funding source to do that. And they had a tax measure for climate change action, and so they could take that money and use it for this program, which is really cool. But I do want to say that I also noticed last week that the U.S. Treasury has changed its definition of SUV so that more vehicles could actually qualify for the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act. So SUVs costing up to $80,000 could get a tax credit, while passenger vehicles were eligible up to $55,000 for the vehicle. And so many crossovers, quote unquote crossovers, were left out of the 80,000 SUV limit, and so they were reorganized eventually into the SUV bin by the Treasury so that they fit under that $80,000 credit. So first off, I don't know, if you can afford an $80,000 car, do you really need a $7,500 tax credit? Probably not. I guess you are a consumer of energy more than other people. They say it tends to be an income level thing. But it's crazy because these things are so much heavier and cause so much more pollution from their lithium demand, from their tire wear. And then they're qualifying for this huge tax break, which is ultimately meant to clean the environment. I think that's why we're doing these tax breaks. So if we have a goal, we need incentives that move towards that goal and not against it, in my opinion. But that's why I think that, it'd be so much better if we spent, instead of giving one person or one family $7,500 for an $80,000 SUV, we give, 5 families or 5 folks, 6 folks, 7 folks money to do an e-bike rebate. I mean, it seems like that would be a huge difference in terms of changing the amount of travel that's undertaken with electric vehicles. And it seems like from this Denver example, it's super popular. So I think that there's something there. There's something there, and hopefully folks can replicate what Denver's been doing. And this article in Smart Cities Dive actually gives you some ideas about how they did it, which is really cool. Okay, cutting-edge cities and biodiversity. Human settlements over time are known for reconfiguring the environment to the benefit of residents, often to the detriment of overall biodiversity. But a new finding suggests that there are ways that cities can foster different plant and animal species in a way that's beneficial. Cities around the world are now embracing this and figuring out ways to enhance biodiversity to support climate goals, well-being, and tourism. This was by Eric Margoley in The New Republic. So one of the issues here is that we need to really protect areas with rich biodiversity and thinking about ways to do that as well. So cities that are growing really quickly often have incentives to tear down green environments, but ultimately those environments need protection, especially wildlife corridors and other ways of protecting those connections between animals and plants and the way that the ecosystem is connected, especially in places like Los Angeles. I mean, LA drivers are killing mountain lions on highways faster than they can reproduce, and the reproduction numbers. There was a study, or there was some look last week at how many mountain lions were dying on highways, and ultimately, the scientists say that they can't reproduce fast enough to actually keep going as a species if we keep on killing them with cars. So, our built environment really needs to support more biodiversity and not actively destroy it in that way. So this was a really interesting piece. They talked about, places, making up for some of their potential loss in development through ecotourism and things like that. In Rio de Janeiro, the favelas and the informal settlements also have a lot of biodiversity, but there's a need to not to create access to more biodiverse spaces for the population while not also tearing down spaces that could be used for development as well. So things like that. I think that's a really important thing to think about, especially when we're talking about cities and we're talking about the encroachment of cities on wild areas, or even building new cities. I'm thinking of I think it's Nana Sutra or something along those lines. Nana Sutra, I think it's that. But basically Jakarta. They're going to move the capital from Jakarta to this new place on Borneo Island, and unfortunately, and I hope I'm getting all this right, but unfortunately, it seems like they're going to make a new city out of the middle of a really green area, and I don't know if that's actually good for the environment overall. Rather than keeping the center of government in Jakarta and fixing the problems there instead of creating new problems where you put a new city. But that's just me. All right, next up, Transit Costs Project releases executive summary. The Transit Costs Project, housed at the Marion Institute of Urban Management at NYU, has released its executive summary for the findings, looking at over 900 transit projects around the world. The authors argue that it's important to study the costs of rapid transit projects because the ability to construct them is worth a 10% increase in economic gains across the country, among other important goals. And this was by Eric Goldwyn, Ellen Levy et al., and this is the Transit Cost Project. And they've been working on this for a while, and we had Alon on a long time ago to talk about some of his work doing this, but I think that was before this specific project started. But I'm glad they finally released it. And their case study on New York found that they spent twice as much on consultants as they actually did building the Second Avenue subway. And that's pretty damning, I think. And I hope that more case studies illuminate more of their findings about how cities can build transit faster and for less money. We'll have this link in here so people can dive into the report. I haven't quite dove in as deep as I'd like to yet, but I'm sure I will at some point, and maybe we'll have somebody on the show to talk about it. And if you're listening and you're somebody from the Transit Cost Project, we'd love to have you on. But I'll reach out at some point, and hopefully we'll talk about this. We had Paula Lewis on from Eno to talk about their research, which kind of goes in parallel to this stuff. So looking forward to seeing more about what's going on in this research and what lessons can be learned from cities around the world about transit construction costs. Okay, next up, why has construction not had productivity gains? Ezra Klein looks again into building and construction, wondering why construction productivity is down while every other industry is up. There aren't any single issues he can point to about the disparity, but notes that it's getting more troubling that it's harder to build things, which in turn makes it harder to address our most pressing national issues, including climate change and other things. This is Ezra Klein in the New York Times. This is tied a bit to the previous article, the Transit Cost Project. Ezra has been writing about these kind of building issues, and why we can't build things as fast as we used to and all those things. And he doesn't really have an answer, and I don't think a lot of us have an answer. If we did, we'd probably be able to solve it really quickly. But the anecdotes that he gets point to kind of a lot of different issues, including more paperwork and back office people for the construction to tell insurance companies what they're doing, and local agencies and permitting officials and those types of things. You also have to get public approval for any project that you build. It's much easier to design software and build software in a computer than it is to build a building or build a subway line, for example. And for me, I think we have too many people in the room sometimes when it comes to getting things done or getting things approved. We should have a limited amount of time. We shouldn't people shouldn't be able to come in like 2 years later and say, well, I wasn't consulted even though they didn't live there 2 years ago. So when the project started. So those types of things, I think, are really dragging down the productivity of building things because it takes so long to get through the process of planning them and then building them. So it's not just an American issue either. It's actually, he found it was actually worldwide. Other countries have the same kind of problem. The productivity of building things, whether it's transit or buildings or anything else, waterworks, those types of things, just is longer for some reason. And I think a lot of these things point to that. And there's also safety equipment regulations and things that are obviously a good thing that have changed a lot since those pictures of all those people sitting with lunchboxes on top of tall buildings in New York, those posters that they have in lots of buildings and things. So interesting to think about that too. So maybe we just pick one way to do it and then run that direction. Who knows? But it's not working for us now. And I think Ezra's on the right track in terms of questioning why it's a problem. And then we need to figure out how it can be fixed. Okay, next up. The bike lanes, the best new bike lanes in the United States. More and more bike lanes and low stress bike networks were built around the country in 2022, but People for Bikes wanted to pick the best executed that were worth copying. They found wonderfully designed project lanes from Jersey City to Spartanburg, South Carolina. They, however, saved the top spot for car-free streets implemented in cities around the country after the pandemic. This was by Martina Haggerty in People for Bikes. So I was impressed at how many mid-sized cities there were on this list. Bloomington, Indiana, Spartanburg, South Carolina, Providence, Bethesda, Maryland, which actually Matt Johnson of Track 29, I believe, worked on, which is cool. I think I saw him posting that project from his window, his office window, which is really great. So it's cool stuff. Lots of really good bike lanes, lots of really good examples to follow. Places all around the country, Pittsburgh, etc., that did really good projects. So definitely check that out. If you get a chance, go to the link, the People for Bikes link in the show notes, because it was actually a really popular one. It was one of the most popular items that we've posted in a long time. Several hundred, click-throughs, getting close to 1,000 actually. So really cool that people were really interested in this story and finding out what the best bike lanes were. But ultimately, the big winners were car-free streets, as they said at the end of as I said at the end of the item. I hope we can do more of these, because I just tell you from the Sanchez example here in Noe Valley that it's been amazing. It's just so nice to have a bigger space, a car-free space. Well, not car-free, because there are cars that drive on it that live on the street. People that live on the street drive their cars, but it's just so nice to walk there and not really have to worry. You know that the cars are going to slow themselves down because they know that there's people walking in the streets. It makes things more even. And I head that direction a lot and have a lot of meetings on that street and talk to people on that street. And it's great to have a place that's coded for people. So I really, really appreciate that. Okay, Pittsburgh rethinks its budget process for climate and equity. Pittsburgh is redesigning its budget to fund climate and equity priorities that previously had little money available. By rethinking the whole budget through a priority-based process, the city is able to make sure its spending was supporting its priorities. The program, however, isn't meant to remove departments that aren't focused on climate, but to realize how changes can be made over time to align with city climate and equity goals. This was by Claire Elise Thompson in Grist. So this is really cool. I think this is kind of this article is underplayed. I mean, it was a popular article and something that people click through on, but I feel like this can be something that can be used for any city budgeting process or thing that people really think is important to the city overall, whether that's equity, whether that's climate, whether that's any other large goal that has interlocking pieces at different city departments. And I think that idea for restructuring a city budget by kind of taking apart the pieces and putting it back together such that everybody's on the same page is really cool. It doesn't mean everybody has to be super climate forward. It just means you're looking for the places where there's synergy, where there's an ability to find places where you might have missed something before. I mean, everybody knows that when there's a big transportation or urban planning project, there's multiple agencies that have to be involved, generally transportation planning, urban planning, the permitting department, building codes, et cetera, and so it would be really cool if you restructured a budget full cloth to think about how to integrate all those things to make it easier to pursue those goals. And that could be through purchasing, that could be through all of those processes that cities go through that when you're at a public meeting and you're like, well, why didn't so-and-so talk to so-and-so? It actually might be a way for the city to put those goals front and center and then have a reason why the departments can talk to each other. So I think that's really cool. And, some of those overlaps aren't obvious when the cities are in there, but it's obvious to people on the outside. So I think this is really cool. I hope folks get a chance to check out this idea that Pittsburgh put together for climate and equity. Okay, changing thinking on gender mobility. Language about vulnerable users in gender mobility discourse needs to be rethought. By placing women into a vulnerable user category, even though they make up half the population, male transit habits become the norm while keeping women on the fringe. Women also need to be in leadership positions in the transit sector so that they can shape conversations around important transit-related decisions. And this was by Isabel Dufeld in Eltis, which is a European publication, a transportation urban planning publication. And she's had actually several items in this last week about gender mobility and gender equality, those types of things. I think there was a major conference and they had some panels. And I think this actually came from one of the panels too, where they were talking about these issues. And, I really think it was an interesting piece, and it hits on something that falls between the cracks when people talk about how to be more accommodating on issues and concerns people are facing. I feel like we see this all the time, that women are placed in the vulnerable user category instead of empowered to make changes that would make their travel easier based on the way that they use transport infrastructure. And so like they said, many of the ways that we engineer roads or plan cities are based on a male perspective without second thought for non-male users. So it makes sense that we get all the voices to discuss planning and ideas rather than just a singular one, and also not placing half the population in this category of vulnerable user, because that doesn't really actually make sense from a just kind of a gross thinking, an overall thinking standpoint. So I think that this is really interesting to think about, and kind of actually got me to like, kind of turn my brain around a little bit, and I really appreciate that. Okay, next up. What should rent control accomplish? As housing gets more expensive for renters, governments are looking for ways to protect tenants through regulations like rent control, but how rent control should be used and implemented is a bone of contention between government officials and activists. In Boston, activists are upset about a 10% rent control proposal from the mayor's office, saying it doesn't go far enough to keep people from being displaced. This was by Jared Bray in Governing. Oh, what a messy conversation. I think housing in general always feels messy. What type of housing is best? What type of regulation should we have? And the discourse is really varied and intense, and always certain groups fighting other groups about how we do things and who benefits and all those types of things. Of course, that's the discussion politics creates. And in this instance, Boston leaders seem to be looking at a way to slow the increases, but it doesn't go far enough for the activists. So the proposal is interesting. It caps annual rent increases at the rate of inflation pegged to the consumer price index, which I think is what it is here in San Francisco, plus 6% in their telling in Boston, with a maximum cap at 10% regardless of any inflation. And so, but for the advocates, they don't think that the rent control measures should just prevent the most egregious forms of price gouging, as it says in the article. They should keep rents affordable over time, and by capping annual increases at 10%, that won't accomplish any of that, they believe. And they think that the rent cap should be the same as CPI, which it is here in San Francisco. So I think that's really fascinating. I mean, looking at it from that perspective of, two sides. One side is trying to kind of, protect renters completely, keep evictions from happening, make sure that the lifetime rents stay low because you can't go do a 10% on 10% on 10% increase. But then on the other side of the coin, there's the officials who are trying to do something for this group of people, but also they're trying to also not get the landowners and the apartment renters mad at them as well. And so I found this quote by Leba, one of the activists, really interesting. We believe that in the right to housing, and those people believe in the right to make money off people's housing. That's a pretty stark way to look at it, I think. And it's interesting to see where people fight on the issue. And so, if those are the sides, I think that that's probably better than the rent control versus no rent control side. But I think it's interesting to have that conversation. Okay. Here's a few bonus items. So those were the ones that we just talked about. Those are the ones that were part of the most read group, the ones that had the most clicks during the week. These are items that I posted in the newsletter that I thought were interesting from the last 2 weeks. And if you want to get the newsletter every day, I would definitely recommend it. I highly recommend subscribing. You can get a 2-week free trial. Go to theoverheadwire.com. I think it's on the top right of the site. You can click on it, and all you need is your email address. You don't need a credit card or anything like that. Just sign up, and you can get the newsletter, which has 30 to 40 items every day, and the top 3 that I suggest for folks that I think are interesting. And so some of these bonus items are from the top 3s. There's been a general standard for designing parking spaces for cars, but now people are noticing that cars are getting to be too big for them. But more space also costs money and can mean the difference between a project penciling or not. This is in Motherboard. by Aaron Gordon, who's a great writer and has a lot of really good articles lately. So in the article, he says that every 5 years or so, the Parking Consultants Council analyzes the U.S. car sales data. It then calculates the 85th percentile. Where have we ever heard 85th percentile before? That's bad. Or the size of the car that is bigger than 85% of cars sold, but is smaller than the other 15%. And the design vehicle is picked, and basically the parking space is designed around it. And lately it's been 16 feet and 10 inches long, which is the exact width of a Ford F-150, which is a very popular vehicle in the United States. But lately these parking lot, the calculations have been off because all of these huge vehicles, and so the parking spaces are getting too small, or actually I would say the cars are getting too big for the spaces and they can't fit. And you notice this, I think, if you've ever driven somewhere and you go into a parking garage and they have the spaces that say compact versus the spaces that are for other vehicles. That's how they kind of get around it sometimes. They're like, well, these spaces are for compact vehicles, the ones that are smaller, and these spaces are for larger vehicles. What a compact vehicle is, but nobody knows because it's not mentioned anywhere what that definition of that is. You just kind of have to assume that you're a compact car or not. But it also goes to the discussion about how much parking costs, right? How much a surface lot versus a underground garage versus a structured parking space costs. So in one space, if it's a surface lot, it usually costs about $7,500 a space, which is that's a lot of money for a parking space. But for an underground garage, it can be up to $200,000 per space if you're digging down, or for a structured parking garage, it's $40,000 to $45,000 per space. So you're spending a whole car to build a parking space. You're spending like a Maserati or a Bugatti's worth of car if you're doing an underground garage, and that's a lot of money, which is pretty crazy. It's a lot to keep that up and spend money. Then I think that's why it's really important to think about basically how much we are subsidizing car driving, but also how much people don't pay for the extra costs of car driving. I mean, the building pays, and I guess when you go to a grocery store, you're paying for their parking because they're paying the property taxes on that, and that costs more. But in this instance specifically, the reason why the parking spaces size is such an important thing is if building folks are supposed to provide 50 spaces, but the 50 spaces have to be large as the largest vehicle instead of small as the smallest vehicle. You can imagine that 50 spaces are going to increase the cost of the parking garage by a lot because the space cost is going to increase. So I think that's really interesting from there. I'm going to go through these actually kind of quicker. I didn't go through that one as quickly as I thought I would. I just like talking about parking, I guess. This next one is, as more white-collar workers are allowed to do remote work, Mexico City becomes a popular destination to work for Americans. The cost of living is low, and more people from lots of countries are heading there. But some locals aren't happy about the movement, and Mexican citizens are being pushed out. This was in Compact magazine. So it's cheaper in Mexico City, but not for the locals. And I think this kind of points to me that we should really make home less expensive so we're not pushing people on other countries. A lot of folks that live in Mexico City now are like software developers from California who can afford a different lifestyle there than they can here and say if they lived in San Francisco. They can get bigger places or they can afford their coffee every day is what it says in the article, but the locals are really not happy about it. Okay, papers from researchers at the University of Sydney and the University of Melbourne look at the value of spending transportation money on larger infrastructure projects versus smaller improvements and found that perhaps the smaller improvements have greater value overall. Time savings on big projects, they say, are much easier to quantify and sell than increased social inclusion. So I think that's a really important point. If you do a lot of bus service in the suburbs and you actually allow people to participate in society versus being locked in their neighborhood overall, you're actually increasing the connectivity between people. Whereas time savings on a big project, which as we talked with Greg and Jonathan last week on the Talking Headways podcast, time savings shouldn't actually be a measure. It's just a measure of mobility, not necessarily accessibility. And so we're making all of these construction decisions based on, mobility when we really should be making them on inclusion, accessibility, and those types of things. So this was kind of reiterated in this research, and I think that that's a really important point to make. And I think that, I like a large project as much as the next person, but I also think that we are spending billions and billions of dollars on these construction costs for these huge projects that may be the 30-year budget for operating for some transit agency for running a really robust bus service. And so you really need to weigh those costs when you're thinking about making those investments. I think that downtown extension for Caltrain and California High Speed Rail is really important, but it's also dumb that they think it's going to cost $9 billion for a mile of tunnel with the stops already built. That's insane. And what could you do with $9 billion if you were Muni in terms of bus ridership, in terms of bus service? It's crazy. So that's the thinking that they're talking about. 940,000 apartments were in the pipeline in 2023, according to the National Association of Home Builders. That's the highest it's been since 1973. The number is expected to drop again next year as high mortgage rates are tamping down housing demand. That was in Route 50. So I think that's really interesting. That's actually the highest rate of apartment construction since 1973. That's a big number, and I can't believe that it's taken since 1973 to build apartments again at that rate. An interesting interview with NCDOT Deputy Director for Multimodal Transportation, Julie White. There's a discussion about what more work from home might mean for transportation systems, especially transit, rethinking them to focus away from commuters and instead zero in on all-day service that one can use at any time to support whatever lifestyle you live is quite refreshing. So I think she called it like lifestyle commuter rail, but I think what they're trying to talk about is kind of going away from this hub and spoke model of journey to work trips that are served by transit in the peak AM, PM hours and actually spreading that service across the whole day and actually making it for people who want to use transit as a way to get around rather than just get to work. I think that's a really important point. Okay, I got a couple more. Finland's Environmental Institute measured the consumption emissions of all the country's cities and regions for the first time. They found that 83% of emissions came from households, 11% from municipal procurement, and 6% from investments. Roughly half of the emissions are coming from consumption of items from or services from abroad. So if you're trying to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, this is a really good thing to know. And I wish more cities would do this kind of accounting because it's really important to think about where your emissions are coming from. And in Helsinki's instance, 50% of the household emissions are coming from services and items that are outside of the country. And so trying to get a fix on how you reduce the emissions is really interesting from that perspective, especially when you're trying to regulate things locally, but ultimately it's a global issue. Transport for London has recently formed its own commercial property company to build more housing and multi-use spaces on property adjacent to transit stations. The profits will be reinvested into the transport system, but there's also a larger goal of generating larger benefits for the region. This was in Transport Extra, really some TOD stuff. And finally, SEPTA head Leslie Richards has dampened advocates' hope for Roosevelt Boulevard subway, stating there's just not enough budget for the big project. But many are wondering how projects that cost billions of dollars and will see lesser benefits like the King of Prussia rail extension are getting built. This was in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I think that's a really good point. 186,000 riders is the estimate for Roosevelt. And I think that it's like 10,000 to 20,000 riders maybe for the King of Prussia extension. I'm sure that project is an okay project, maybe. I don't know too much about it. I've been on one of the SEPTA lines that goes that direction, but towards Bryn Mawr, I think that was the one that I was on. And so I'm not too familiar with the region, but I think that that's an important point. You know, if you're trying to build a line that only gets 10,000 riders versus a line with 186,000 riders, I've had this discussion before about Austin and the commuter rail versus the light rail down the center of the city. I think it's important to, even if it costs more money, it might per passenger or per benefit, it might actually be a better project. Or, you can take that billions and millions of dollars and spend it on bus service. But I think the expansions are important, but, there is money out there. It's just in the highways. It's in the highway money. That's where it is. And I think that people need to start realizing that it's not one transit project versus another transit project. There are trade-offs in terms of deciding what is actually valuable or not. But all the money is in the the transportation projects that are from highways. Okay, this week and every week, I want to thank our generous Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome and keep the show going by listening and supporting each month. This show and Talking Headways really wouldn't be here without it, so thank you very much. And you can support the show by going to patreon.com/theoverheadwire. We've had people sign up each month during this pandemic, so we're super appreciative of that. $2 a month, you get you some stickers and a handwritten note, especially that Cars Are Cholesterol sticker. It's really cool, I promise. And $10 a month will get you one of our transportation scarves, whichever one you choose. So email, when you sign up, I'll email you and I'll ask you which scarf you want. And or if you don't respond, I'll send you the bus only. But yeah, looking forward to more folks ordering scarves, more people becoming Patreon supporters. We really appreciate it. It really does help us out. Helps me get Sophia paid for editing the podcast and those types of things. So really do appreciate it. Also, we did an audiobook version of Raymond Unwin's 1909 classic, Town Planning and Practice. If you want to get your hands on one, go to raymondunwin.com. And if you have any listeners' questions or comments, feel free to tweet at us or comment on any of the social sites where the podcast appears: LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Mastodon, theoverheadwire@gmail.com. Email us. I might not be able to. I might not get to it every week, but I know that folks. I appreciate you writing, and you can write stuff that won't even. If you want to write me and don't want to be on the show, that's cool too. I'm more than happy with that as well. Okay, so finally, puppies and butterflies. This is part of the show where we talk about something fun, interesting, or maybe just didn't fit in the other sections. So a couple of weeks ago, I came across this story about sustainable concrete in Japan. And the concrete could actually be made out of food waste. And that's cool. And I think that that's interesting. It reminds me of Mr. Fusion from Back to the Future. But the other thing they were really happy about was that you could eat it. You could eat the concrete. And I personally don't need to eat my concrete, but I thought that was really fascinating. So they gave you a recipe basically for putting it together. So after breaking the raw materials, orange peels, onions, pumpkins, bananas, Chinese cabbage, and seaweed, they took the small pieces and placed it in an oven at 105 degrees centigrade or a vacuum drying machine. Then the dry materials were pulverized using a blender. Subsequently, the powder was mixed with water and seasonings and finally hot pressed at 180 degrees centigrade. I don't need to eat my concrete, and it's cool that they're coming up with sustainable concrete ideas. And concrete is a really heavy greenhouse gas emitter, but I just think it's so funny that they're like, oh yeah, and you can eat it too, and it tastes okay. I was like, well then what's the point? Are you making it to eat it, or are you making it to be concrete? Anyways, I thought that was funny. And finally, last time I forgot to mention this because of the power outage, but Conan O'Brien did an oral history of the monorail episode for The Simpsons, and let me just say that the episode is the planning professional equivalent of people yelling "Run, Forrest, Run" at distance runners, which happened to me a lot after Forrest Gump came out. They should be yelling "Monorail, monorail, monorail" at road engineers, not at transit planners. Please, please. So I know a lot of you have been traumatized by the monorail episode of The Simpsons. It's a genius episode, but it also has created a lot of yelling and pushback for folks in the field. All right. Well, you can find me on Twitter at @TheOverheadWire or at TheOverheadWire.com. You can find me on Mastodon too at TheOverheadWire at sfba.social. Thanks for joining us at Mondays at The Overhead Wire. Thanks to our generous patrons for sponsoring this week's podcast. I'm going to go drink the rest of this wine. I hope you all have a wonderful Valentine's Day. Oh, that's right. It's Valentine's Day on Tuesday, the 14th. This is a Monday show, but I imagine that most of you will hear this on the Tuesday. So happy Valentine's Day to you all, and give everybody a hug for us. We'll see you next time.
Talk